The hum of the environmental controls was a constant, low thrum, a mechanical heartbeat that regulated the vast, climate-controlled expanse of the archival warehouse. Within this meticulously ordered domain, Blake moved with practiced efficiency. Every document, every ledger, every brittle photograph had its designated place, its unique accession number, its precise metadata entry. Blake, an archivist of uncommon diligence, found solace in the absolute certainty of classification, the immutable logic of information retrieval. Their work was the bulwark against chaos, a quiet testament to the enduring power of fact. Today's task involved a long-dormant section, the records from the decommissioned border checkpoint. Decades of operational minutiae, personnel transfers, vehicle manifests, and customs declarations lay stacked in acid-free boxes. The checkpoint itself had been dismantled years prior, its concrete barriers and corrugated metal structures repurposed for other, less sensitive, logistical hubs. Now, only its paper ghost remained, awaiting Blake's discerning eye. Blake donned thin cotton gloves, a ritualistic gesture of respect for the fragile past. They selected the first box, marked BC Alpha 73, Incident Reports, Q3 1987. The cardboard yielded with a dry rasp. Inside, a dense block of yellowing forms and carbon-copied memos. Blake began the methodical process: remove item, verify against manifest, assess condition, scan, rebox. The air grew heavy with the scent of aged paper and faintly metallic dust. Hours dissolved into the rhythm of the work. Then, a discrepancy. Not in the manifests, which were predictably exhaustive, but within the contents of a specific file. Box BC Gamma 112, Vehicle Logs and Seizures, Q1 1993. Blake pulled a folder labeled Miscellaneous Contraband. Expecting to find reports detailing confiscated tobacco, illicit liquor, or perhaps a few poorly disguised firearms, they instead encountered a single, small object nested amongst the brittle paperwork. It was a box, no larger than a child's fist, carved from a dark, dense wood. Its surface was smooth, almost polished, but not quite. Under the focused beam of Blake's desk lamp, the grain seemed to shift, subtly, imperceptibly. Blake blinked, then leaned closer. The wood was dark, yes, but not uniformly so. Patches of deep, almost oily black swirled into areas that were merely a rich mahogany, then back again. It was like observing smoke caught under a glass, but utterly static. Blake ran a gloved finger over the surface. The wood felt cool, impossibly so for an object stored in a climate-controlled environment. There was no entry for it in the contraband log. No inventory number. No descriptive text, no seizure report. It simply was an uncatalogued anomaly within a meticulously catalogued folder. Blake's initial reaction was a prickle of professional irritation. A misfiling, a lapse in procedure. This was the kind of oversight that frayed the edges of their precisely ordered world. They turned the box over in their hands. It had no discernible lid, no visible seams. The carvings that adorned its sides were intricate, a series of looping, knot-like patterns that seemed to intertwine and then dissolve into themselves without beginning or end. They were not geometric, not organic. They simply were. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor ran through Blake's fingers. But the unease began to deepen. The patterns on the box, initially appearing decorative, now seemed to possess a strange, almost hypnotic quality. Blake felt their gaze snagged, pulled into the impossible turns of the carving. It wasn't just wood grain shifting, the patterns themselves seemed to subtly reconfigure, like a slow-motion kaleidoscope operating on a timeline too vast for immediate perception. Blake held it steady. The air in the archive, once a comforting hum, now felt thin, dry. They felt a peculiar pressure behind their eyes, a dull ache that seemed to emanate from the object itself. This was not a misplaced item. This was an item that defied placement. It shouldn't exist, yet it did. Blake's meticulous nature, usually a source of strength, now felt like a vulnerability. The box was an absence of information, yet it radiated a profound, unsettling presence. Blake carefully placed the small wooden box on a clean sheet of archival paper. They removed their gloves, feeling a sudden, inexplicable need for direct contact with the world. The pressure behind their eyes intensified. This object, seemingly innocuous, had introduced a discordant note into the symphony of their ordered reality. It was a single, wrong detail that threatened to unravel the entire composition. They knew, with a certainty that transcended the immediate discomfort, that they would not be able to leave this anomaly unexamined. The border checkpoint, it seemed, had held more than just mundane contraband. And Blake, the archivist, had just opened the first door. Every document, every ledger, every brittle photograph had its place, its precise coordinates in a system Blake had helped refine. Yet, the object now resting on the illuminated examination table defied such classification. It was a slab, roughly the size of a large book, crafted from a material Blake could not identify. Its surface, a matte, obsidian black, absorbed light rather than reflecting it, creating an unsettling visual void. When Blake ran a gloved finger across it, the texture was cool and impossibly smooth, like polished glass but without the inherent fragility. There was no discernible seam, no etched mark, no inscription. It simply was. Blake had discovered it nestled amongst a collection of early 20th century geological survey photographs, an anachronism that had eluded all previous cataloging efforts. A peculiar, almost imperceptible pressure seemed to emanate from the object, a subtle thrum that resonated not in the ears, but somewhere deeper, behind the eyes. Blake dismissed it as fatigue, a common side effect of extended focus. The archivist meticulously documented its dimensions, weight, and spectral analysis. The results were inconclusive, composition unknown. Non-ferrous, non-organic. Density inconsistent with observed mass. The internal systems offered no matches, no historical context. This blank slate was an affront to Blake's ordered world, a silent challenge. Days blurred into a single, extended period of obsessive research. Blake neglected assigned tasks, the backlog of pending requests growing unaddressed. The warehouse, usually a place of quiet, methodical work, became a solitary chamber for this singular pursuit. Blake combed through digital databases, microfilm journals, and obscure historical society records. The search was not for the object itself, which remained unique, but for anything that might echo its profound strangeness. The first hint emerged from a forgotten municipal planning report from the 1930s, detailing proposed infrastructure projects. Buried within a footnote concerning geological stability near a coastal region, a brief mention referred to unusual seismic resonance patterns, locally attributed to subterranean formations of indeterminate origin. The language was vague, almost dismissive, but the phrase indeterminate origin snagged Blake's attention. It was a thread, thin and frayed, but a thread nonetheless. Blake's research spiraled, drawing in disparate, seemingly unrelated documents. An old fisherman's log from the 1950s spoke of the deep hum that steals the mind, observed near a specific stretch of coastline. Individually, these were curiosities. Together, they began to form a disturbing, spectral mosaic. Blake tried to articulate these connections to a colleague during a brief lunch break in the staff lounge. "There's a pattern," Blake began, gesturing vaguely, of obscure references to a kind of underlying resonance. Not a sound, exactly, but an influence. It's linked to certain locations, and now I've found this object. The colleague, a younger archivist focused on digital preservation, listened politely, then offered a sympathetic smile. "Blake, you getting enough sleep? You look like you've been wrestling with a particularly stubborn data migration." The implied dismissal was clear. How could one describe a sensation, a disquieting wrongness, to someone who only saw a tired face? The isolation deepened. Blake began to notice things. The warehouse's fluorescent lights seemed to flicker at the very edge of perception, an almost subliminal strobe. The low hum of the environmental controls occasionally shifted, descending into a lower, almost guttural thrum that vibrated in the bones. Blake would pause, listening intently, but the sound would always return to its usual drone, leaving only a lingering sense of doubt. Was the artifact influencing the senses, or was Blake simply exhausted, the mind playing tricks? The question gnawed, a persistent splinter beneath the skin. One evening, deep into the night, Blake uncovered a heavily redacted government survey from the late 1960s. The report pinpointed a specific geographical anomaly as the potential source of these phenomena, a location referred to repeatedly as the border checkpoint. It was not a conventional border. The context suggested a geographical marker, a point of demarcation near the sea. The report concluded with a recommendation for long-term observation and containment protocols, though no such protocols were ever implemented, or if they were, no record remained in the archives. Blake reread the passage, the words burning into the retina. The border checkpoint. The object, the obscure documents, the growing disquiet, they all coalesced around this single, stark location. The archivist's methodical pursuit of order had unearthed something profoundly disordered, a fissure in the known. The rational mind screamed for caution, for a return to the safety of cataloging and verifiable facts. The border checkpoint awaited. The colleague's polite dismissal had been a chisel, not a hammer, but it had nonetheless struck a fracture in Blake's resolve. They retreated from the archives, not to rest, but to the small, sterile apartment that had become a secondary research station. The artifact, a dull obsidian sphere with no discernible seams, lay on the coffee table, a silent, magnetic core around which Blake's world now spun. Its surface, under the harsh glare of a desk lamp, sometimes seemed to absorb the light, sometimes to emit a faint, internal luminescence that only Blake could perceive. Each waking hour was dedicated to cross-referencing the obscure texts, the forgotten ledgers, the coded marginalia that had accompanied the artifact's rediscovery. A recurring motif, a symbol resembling an inverted delta, appeared in the most unlikely places, a faded ink drawing in a 17th-century travelogue, a carved mark on a rusted metal plate described in a surveyor's notes from the 1930s. Finally, a geographical coordinate embedded within a fragmented communique from a century-old border dispute. All roads, all fragmented paths, seemed to converge on a singular, unsettling location, a specific border checkpoint. The notion was absurd. Why would an archival anomaly lead to a contemporary security installation? Yet, the compulsion was absolute. Blake felt drawn, not by logic, but by an undeniable current. The journey was a blur of highway asphalt and muted landscapes. Blake drove, the artifact secured in a padded case on the passenger seat, its presence a tangible weight. The determination that had been a quiet hum in the archives now resonated like a taut string within their chest. The air grew heavy, thick with an unidentifiable scent, something metallic and cold, like old rain on forgotten iron. The sky, once a uniform gray, now seemed to ripple at the edges of Blake's peripheral vision, an illusion of movement in the static clouds. The place felt abandoned, yet operational, a ghost of bureaucracy. Blake pulled up to the gate, the engine of their vehicle a sudden, deafening roar in the unnatural quiet. The guard, a figure of unremarkable height and build, stepped forward, their movements stiff, almost mechanical. Blake noticed a subtle distortion in the air around the guard, like heat haze, though the temperature was cool. The guard's face seemed to flicker, the features subtly rearranging themselves, a trick of the light, Blake decided, or simply fatigue. Purpose of visit, the guard's voice was flat, devoid of inflection. Blake opened their mouth to explain, to fabricate a reason, but the words caught in their throat. The artifact in the case beside them began to vibrate, a low, resonant thrumming that Blake felt in their teeth. The vibrations intensified, spreading through the vehicle, through the ground itself. The concrete barriers around them pulsed with a faint, deep red glow, a color that seemed to soak into the very air. The guard's eyes, previously an unremarkable brown, now held a depth that seemed to swallow light, reflecting nothing. Blake gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white. The world around the checkpoint was no longer static. The asphalt shimmered, stretching and contracting like a living membrane. The distant trees on the horizon seemed to lean inward, their forms blurring, their branches elongating into impossible filaments. The sound of the wind, previously non-existent, now rose to a shriek, a cacophony of impossible frequencies that clawed at Blake's eardrums. The guard, still standing rigidly, began to speak again, but the words were no longer English. They were a guttural symphony of clicks and rasping sounds, a language that felt ancient and wrong, emanating not from the guard's mouth, but from everywhere at once. A horrifying clarity dawned on Blake. This was not merely a physical border. The artifact was not merely an object, it was a key, a beacon. The guard, the barriers, the office, they were all flimsy constructs, barely holding back the true nature of this place. The inverted delta symbol, Blake now understood, was not a mark of location, but a symbol of passage. The revelation struck Blake with the force of a physical blow, stealing their breath. The world did not just contain horrors, it was built upon them, its very fabric a fragile membrane separating human comprehension from an indifferent, vast reality that defied all order. The artifact had not just shown them a new truth, it had opened them to it. The border checkpoint was not just a place where nations met, it was where existence frayed, where the known brushed against the unknowable. And whatever lay beyond that fraying edge was now, undeniably, bleeding through. The guard, now a grotesque caricature of a human, extended a hand, its fingers elongated, joints bending at unnatural angles. The dull obsidian sphere sat on Blake's kitchen table, a silent, unyielding presence that had absorbed every watt of light and every shred of Blake's attention since their retreat from the archives. The walls hummed with an unheard frequency, a vibration that resonated deep in Blake's molars. Each shadow held a greater density, a richer, more profound blackness than before, as if the very air had thickened with a nascent, unseen substance. Time had become a liquid, pooling and dissipating without warning. Hours bled into minutes, days into fleeting moments. Their reflection in the darkened window showed a stranger, eyes wide, pupils dilated to encompass more than the room offered, skin stretched taut over sharp cheekbones. A tremor ran through Blake's left hand, a sympathetic vibration to the unseen hum. The sphere pulsed, not with light, but with an internal pressure that Blake felt directly behind their eyes. It spoke, not with words, but with an insistent, growing certainty that was not Blake's own. It was a truth, a revelation, that clawed at the foundations of Blake's understanding. The world, the solid, tangible world, was a flimsy construct, a hastily erected scrim hiding something immense and indifferent. Blake saw the patterns now, in the dust motes dancing in the sunbeams, in the intricate branching of a houseplant, in the static cling of a synthetic blanket. These weren't random occurrences, they were ripples, echoes of a vast, underlying geometry that shifted and reformed with an alien logic. Blake pressed their palms to their temples, trying to steady the escalating cacophony of insights. The ceiling fan blades spun, each revolution tracing not just a circle, but an infinite series of overlapping dimensions. There is no here. There is no now. Blake stumbled to the counter, pouring water into a glass, but the liquid shimmered, reflecting not the apartment, but a swirling maelstrom of iridescent nebulae, studded with eyes that watched without seeing. A singular, imperative thought began to form, a crystalline shard in the chaos: go. Not an escape, but a necessary movement. A pilgrimage dictated by the sphere, by the new, terrible truths that had taken root in Blake's mind. Blake didn't know how they knew this, only that the knowledge was absolute, an anchor in the storm. They moved with a dreamlike purpose, gathering a small bag, the obsidian sphere nestled carefully within. Each passerby seemed to move with an unnatural jerkiness, their faces momentarily dissolving into a mosaic of shifting angles before reforming into something vaguely human. Blake felt a profound sense of detachment, as if observing a poorly staged play. The world was not real. It was a performance, and the audience was vast, unseen, and utterly unconcerned. The journey was a blur of shifting landscapes and dislocated moments. Blake found themselves on a bus, then a train, then walking for an eternity through a landscape of muted grays and browns. The internal hum intensified, becoming a roar that drowned out all external sound. The sphere vibrated against Blake's hip, a constant, low thrum, guiding them, pulling them towards the designated point. Eventually, the road narrowed, flanked by tall, corrugated metal fences crowned with barbed wire. A series of imposing concrete structures emerged from the mist, their windows like vacant eyes. This was it, the border checkpoint. The destination. Blake approached the line of idling vehicles and waiting figures. A uniformed guard, a broad-shouldered individual with a stern expression, stood at a booth, examining documents. The guard's features seemed to ripple, blurring at the edges, their uniform shifting in hue. They pulled out a passport, but the photo seemed to morph, the eyes in the picture not Blake's, but something ancient, unblinking. The name printed beneath the image seemed to vibrate, a meaningless arrangement of phonemes. Who was Blake? Had Blake ever truly existed? Purpose of visit, the guard asked, their gaze sharpening, though their eyes still shimmered with an unnatural light. Blake opened their mouth, but no coherent words formed. Instead, a torrent of images flooded their mind, galaxies unfurling like celestial flowers, dimensions folding in upon themselves, the vast, empty spaces between stars teeming with unseen, unspeakable things. The hum from the sphere now resonated through the entire border checkpoint, a low thrum that Blake alone seemed to perceive. The concrete walls seemed to breathe, to expand and contract with the rhythm of some cosmic heart. The other travelers, waiting patiently in line, were nothing more than puppets, their strings visible, manipulated by an invisible hand. "Sir?" Blake clutched the passport. It's all." Thin, they managed to rasp, their voice alien to their own ears. "The membrane. It's tearing." They pointed past the guard, past the checkpoint, into the gray, featureless landscape beyond. "Don't you see it? The geometry. It's wrong." The world was no longer a stage, it was an illusion, a fleeting dream. And Blake, the archivist, the keeper of forgotten truths, was finally awake. The horror was not coming, it had always been here, lurking in the periphery, and now, it was all that remained. The border checkpoint, the guard, Blake's own hands holding the passport, all were dissolving into the vast, indifferent truth. There was no border to cross, only the endless, terrifying expanse. The roaring in Blake's ears was not sound, but absence. A vacuum that swallowed all acoustic information, leaving only the reverberation of what wasn't. The guard's mouth continued its mechanical articulation, a silent puppet show of officialdom. Blake stood before the counter at the border checkpoint, the fluorescent lights above casting a pallid sheen on the plastic laminates and the guard's stoic, unlined face. Every detail, from the faded insignia on the guard's sleeve to the scuff marks on the linoleum, seemed intensely, painfully real, yet simultaneously flimsy, like a stage prop on the verge of collapsing. "Papers, please," the guard's voice finally breached the roaring, thin and reedy, as if transmitted from a vast distance. Blake blinked. The sound was a foreign intrusion, a brief flicker in the eternal silence. They felt a strange, cold calm. The world was an illusion, yes, but Blake was no longer fighting it. Blake reached into their satchel, fingers brushing against the familiar, worn leather. The artifact was not there, of course. It had been gone for days, perhaps weeks. Its influence, however, resonated through every fiber of Blake's being. The true artifact was not an object, but a revelation. Blake pulled out their identification. The plastic card felt heavy, substantial. A small, laminated rectangle of carefully constructed lies. "Purpose of travel?" the guard asked, their gaze fixed on the card. Their eyes were an unremarkable shade of brown, reflecting the sterile glow of the checkpoint. Blake noted the slight tremor in the guard's hand as they held the card, a barely perceptible vibration that spoke of routine, of exhaustion, of 1,000 similar interactions. It was a detail Blake would have dismissed before, but now it resonated with an unsettling significance. Every tremor, every fleeting expression, was a thread in the grand, unraveling tapestry. Blake looked at the photograph on the card. A face stared back, a younger, more confident face. Blake's face. But the features were already blurring at the edges, the smile a grimace of a forgotten dream. The name beneath it, Blake, felt like a label applied to a temporary vessel. A name for a fleeting arrangement of atoms. "To understand," Blake said, the words feeling alien on their tongue, brittle and insufficient. The guard paused, their brow furrowing almost imperceptibly. Their head tilted slightly, a tiny, involuntary movement. Blake watched this shift in expression with an almost scientific interest. It was a pattern, a response, a predictable ripple in the fabricated reality. "Understand what, exactly?" the guard pressed, their tone now edged with a faint, professional suspicion. The roaring intensified, threatening to swallow the guard's voice again. The world was not merely an illusion, it was a skin. A thin, taut membrane stretched over something immense and formless. Blake looked down at their own hands, holding the identification. The lines on their palms, the faint scars on their knuckles, the subtle pulse throbbing beneath the skin, all of it seemed to waver, to lose definition. The very concept of hand felt arbitrary, a convenient categorization. What was a hand, truly? And what if that purpose was merely to perceive the illusion? The guard cleared their throat, a sharp, human sound that cut through the internal drone. "Sir?" Blake needed a clear answer. Blake looked up, meeting the guard's gaze. For a moment, the brown eyes seemed to deepen, to become vast, empty pools reflecting not the checkpoint lights, but something else entirely. The distinction was becoming increasingly meaningless. They saw the guard's mouth open, ready to object, to demand further explanation. But the sound that emerged was not a voice. It was a low, resonant thrum, a vibration that started deep within the guard's chest and spread outwards, distorting the air around them. The uniform's fabric rippled, the plastic counter shimmered, and the fluorescent lights above flickered, not in sequence, but in a chaotic, independent dance of dying embers. Blake's vision blurred. The border checkpoint, with its mundane authority and sterile efficiency, began to melt. The walls softened, the hard edges of the counter dissolved into hazy bands of color. The guard's face stretched and contracted, no longer human, but a shifting, amorphous mass, a momentary configuration of sensation. Blake felt a profound, terrifying peace. This was it. The final dissolution. The world was not unraveling, it was simply ceasing to hold its form. They felt their own body begin to follow suit. A tingling sensation started in their fingertips, spreading rapidly through their arms, up their neck, into the very core of their being. It was not pain, but a gentle, insistent unmaking. Their individual thoughts, their memories, their sense of self all became like grains of sand caught in an immense, silent current, swirling faster and faster, losing their distinctness, blending into the vastness. The boundary between Blake and everything else had finally collapsed. There was no longer a Blake to stand at a border checkpoint. There was only the silent, pervasive truth, an immense, incomprehensible presence that had always been. And Blake, the archivist, the seeker of forgotten truths, was no longer seeking. They were simply part of it. The guard at the border checkpoint leaned forward, scanning the empty space where the individual had stood moments before. Their brow furrowed in confusion. They distinctly remembered taking an identification card, a face, a name. But the counter was clear. The space was empty. They shrugged, a small, weary gesture, and called for the next traveler. The line moved forward, oblivious, into the immense and silent expanse.